sallallahu ta'ala wa sallam ala sayyidina Muhammad wa alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in, amma ba'd. I'm going to try and go through two hadiths. So today it's hadith 14, and I'm going to not over elaborate on this one, and maybe try and do the next one. But I have a feeling you guys might force me to over discuss this as well. So the hadith is as follows. الحديث الرابع عشر عن عبد الله بن مسعود رضي الله تعالى عنه قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم لا يحل دم امرئ مسلم إلا بإحدى ثلاث الثيب الزاني والنفس بالنفس والتارك لدينه المفارق للجماعة. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiallahu ta'ala anhu said, the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wasallam said, the blood of a Muslim man is not permitted to be shed except for one of three things: the adulterous mature person, a person killed in retaliation for the killing of a person, and one who abandons his deen and separates himself from the community. And this is in Bukhari and Muslim. This hadith is narrated in the two Sahih books from Al-A'mash, from Abdullah ibn Murrah, from Masruq ibn Mas'ud. And in Muslim's narration there's this addition: the one who abandons Islam, instead of the words the one who abandons his deen. And obviously this is a recurring theme in many ahadith. In one hadith, it is not permissible to spill the blood of a Muslim man except for one of three things: a man who disbelieved after his acceptance of Islam, or who committed adultery after having experienced intercourse in a valid marriage, or who killed a person but not in retaliation for another person whom he had killed. In a narration of An-Nasa'i, there is: a man who commits adultery after having experienced intercourse in a valid marriage must be stoned, or who kills deliberately must be killed in retaliation, or who reneges after his Islam must be killed. So there's a few things to unpack here. Number one, when I was growing up, right, just reading a hadith out at home was pretty normal, right? So, and hearing hadith like this was normal. That means in our understanding the idea that in Islam there is capital punishment. In Islam a person could lawfully, face death because of certain crimes was pretty non-controversial, well accepted, openly discussed, non-censored. There was no discomfort about talking about these things. What I worry about nowadays is that that if there isn't a culture of Islamic education at home, then there is almost no context for these types of discussions in the public space, because subconsciously this type of thing is being censored, right? And I'll tell you what I mean by subconsciously. Me as an Imam, for example, it's increasingly less and less likely that I would feature this hadith in a khutbah. And there's no good reason for it, there's no good explanation for it. It's subconscious self-censorship. You just don't want the hassle of having to bring up capital punishment in Islam in a public lecture, which increasingly nowadays gets recorded and misconstrued and misrepresented. Right? And I think, it depends. Some people, they don't censor themselves and they don't have a problem with the controversy and they'll face it and they'll fight it. Other people just don't want the hassle. And this of course happened a lot during the War on Terror. Strange commentary on the hadith, but I think it's important to acknowledge this. During the War on Terror, in the UK, we ended up with the Prevent Programme. Do you remember the Prevent Programme? And because of the Prevent Programme, the government launched this programme called this counter-terrorism strategy. I can't remember what the overall strategy was called. it was called, I've forgotten, but they had this four-stage program. I think it was called Contest. I think the policy was Contest 2 or something like that. Anyway, used to be very familiar with it back then. But Prevent became the community level counter-terrorism strategy of the UK government, right? And the idea was to kind of engage the community. There was lots of funding available, so community organizations used to be enticed with something called Prevent funding, and then you buy into the funding, and you could do community activities, etc., with it. And under certain local authorities, in some places, it almost became a spying program, right? So there's always somebody watching, and if they're ignorant about Islam, a bit liberal-minded, then they themselves think something like this should be censored. So you end up with Muslims reporting on Muslims that something fundamentalist or something extremist is being discussed, all right? And so this kind of censorship begins, and then there's constantly people on the watch. There's constantly people on the watch, what's being said, etc. Then social media kicks in, do you understand? And people start getting targeted on social media. Then you end up with these counter-terrorism programs that start to engage in this discourse about what is extremist, what is not extremist, etc., etc. You had Muslim organizations, Muslim-led organizations, controversially, like the Quilliam Foundation. I don't know if anybody remembers stuff like this. Yeah. So one of the things that I quite publicly raised at the time, not to the community, but to officials, the government officials, to the establishment, was that you're forcing us into a situation where Islam cannot all of Islam in its entirety cannot be legitimately discussed, because people are being pushed into this. There's this unspoken pressure to self-censor, right? Because people just don't want the hassle. Because when you guys come after somebody, you come after people based on the assumption of guilt, not based on the assumption of innocence. So if you come after me, I'm unknown to the wider British public. My community knows I'm not an extremist or a terrorist sympathizer or whatever, all these terms that were being thrown about. A radical. In those days, they differentiated between violent extremism and non-violent extremism. So if you're a violent extremist, meaning you believe in calling to violence, then you're a serious extremist, right? But if you're a non-violent extremist, then you're serious enough for them to come after you and defame you and slander you and stuff like that. You understand? So there was all sorts of nonsense, right? And Muslims were falling into the trap of attacking each other, right? And like labeling each other, non-violent extremists to gain favor with the establishment, and this type of thing was going on as well. Terrible kind of. It's not completely gone, still there, but it's a little bit. There's been a massive debate over Prevent, etc. For the most part, it's been discredited, and therefore it's a little bit. The kind of the impact of Prevent is a little bit less intense now, but the overall culture is still there, right? And self-censorship therefore becomes a matter of, we can't really speak about this. We're not going to speak about it because I just don't want the hassle, right? And who's going to defend me? Who's going to defend me? Is my community going to defend me? When I was attacked, so in the midst of all of this, I had a very unhealthy share of getting attacked, right? So in the media first. First, it started off, in my knowledge, it started off with a think tank, with a right-wing think tank, writing a report called. They used to go after everybody, and to be fair, for a while, I remember going through this phase where that think tank used to come after some speakers, and I used to be like, what did they say wrong? You fall into this mindset of they must have said something wrong if these guys are coming after you, until they come after you, and you realize, okay, now what? You kind of learn this really, really important lesson. So they come after me. They come after me in a report called the think tank was Henry Jackson Society. I always like to publicly talk about them so that everybody is warned. So they're called the Henry Jackson Society. This particular report was, so they used to follow the social media accounts and the public lectures of imams and scholars. And then they'd be like, got him. He said this against this and that and the other. And in my case, they found, they picked, obviously they ended up, I got flagged up somehow. I'm not even that popular or anything like that, but he got flagged up anyway. And the fact that I had said homosexuality is a sin publicly, I think they picked up on a particular recording that was out of Nottingham University or something, where I had spoken. I'd been invited to speak by the ISOC. That's it. I'm an extremist. But the consequences of that meant that on a separate occasion, like I used to work for Ibrahim College. Ibrahim College's accounts got closed down. We ended up being investigated by the Charity Commission because it's all interconnected, right? So you end up with certain banks that follow follow lists that kind of they check organizations against lists that have been taken from these right-wing think tanks. And if you subscribe to it, then you tend to come after charities, who've got speakers associated with them who, a lot of charities, kind of ended up with their accounts closed in that way. The Charity Commission ended up with, under the influence, in fact, headed up by right-wing people, famous, well-known Islamophobic kind of individuals from the establishment, ended up taking charge of the Charity Commission. A lot of Muslim charities kind of came under attack and came under scrutiny. So again, it's the connection, right? So it's the right-wing thinkers connected to these right-wing kind of anti-Islamophobic type people. They're in the Charity Commission. Before you know it, you're under investigation from the Charity Commission, right? Because somebody did a report on your principle. So that happens. So naturally you self-censor. Why would you want to talk about this stuff if they're going to come after you in this way? Completely separate incident. One of our students from college used to run a madrasa, like Makarim here. He used to run a madrasa in his town, in Slough. Away from us in East London, where we used to be. In Slough, right? How do you, look at the way it connects up. A Daily Telegraph reporter starts investigating his activities. So he used to run a youth organization in Slough, and he'd invite speakers from all over the place. I'm one of his teachers. He's invited me. This reporter is watching, checking every single person. And so, I'm in there, other people are invited. But he finds me in that Henry Jackson Society report, right? This poor guy used to rent a local school to run his madrasa. Do you understand? So the school comes under pressure from this guy. Could you please explain to me in writing why it is that you are renting premises to an organization that invites extremist speakers, i.e. me, okay? After his investigation is concluded, he manages to get approval for an article in the Daily Telegraph, and now I'm splashed all over the Daily Telegraph as an extremist preacher. All in all, I'm actually as moderate as, if there's such a word, right, as moderate as they get, right? But this stuff is going on. So you self-censor. Okay? What is the impact on that on our children? The impact on that on our children is there's parts that they get exposed to parts of Islam, not exposed to other parts of Islam, and they have no legitimate recourse to the explanations of those particular parts of Islam. We're kind of self-censoring as a community. And who loses out? Our own children, right? Our own children lose out. The other day, I'll give you an example. I don't know if this is a consequence of that, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was. You'd have to do some really fine research to be able to identify. But let's say it's a coincidental correlation, right? So I'm in a class of, teaching a class of 12, 13 and 14-year-olds, right? So it's our senior class. So they're basically the year 8s and year 9s, yeah? And we're studying Seerah. And as part of themselves. So I took the strategy that, I don't have enough time to teach them the whole seerah, so I'm going to try and get them into the habit of reading the seerah, right? But every now and then I get them to memorize something. So this time, memorize the names of the wives of the Prophet ﷺ, the Ummahatul Mu'mineen, etc., etc. So we start talking about the fact that the Prophet's wives, so the kids pick up on wives, right? So I tell them that the Prophet, that the average Muslim man can marry 4, right? And then the Prophet ﷺ was allowed to have 9 at any one time. When I was young, this was, you didn't bat an eyelid because it's so discussed so widely, so well known, right? And the explanations were not even sophisticated. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave the Prophet more power, or whatever. We didn't hear about the fact that some of these marriages had political implications, etc. None of the kind of answers that you engage in apologetics. Simple answers, you carried on. No big deal. I had laughter in the classroom. I had one kid kind of almost like bordering on mockery. Not his fault. He doesn't know. Bashara, right? Bordering on mockery and so on and so forth. And I thought to myself, wow, like how times have changed where Muslim kids aren't exposed to even that level of detail about the Prophet ﷺ's life, and doesn't know the Ummahatul Mu'mineen and that there were many of them, and etc., etc. And one of the things that I recall why you didn't bat an eyelid, right, is because in an Islamic context, we discuss these aspects within the context of piety. Even fighting was discussed within the context of piety. My father was Tablighi, right? So he used to read Fadail A'mal at home. Fadail A'mal, the Tablighi book or collection of Fadail, right? And we never used to let him read any other chapter. We never used to let him read any chapter other than Hikayat al-Sahaba, right? The chapter that was about the stories of the Sahaba. And usually they were stories about fighting, right? It was about jihad. It was about the heroism of the Sahaba, as I would put it. The heroism of the Sahaba, their great exploits in battle and so on and so forth. And it didn't, I once spoke about this at a conference in Damascus of all places, and I said, it didn't make me a terrorist. I told this story. I said, it didn't make me a terrorist. I didn't think about blowing myself up because as a child, I grew up on the stories of the heroism of the Sahaba, on stories of jihad. And it did make me think, I want to fight in the way of Allah and so on and so forth. But it didn't make me think about going and killing innocent people, because all of these conversations were never divorced from a conversation about right and wrong piety. Right? These are not people who went and killed other people in the battlefield only. They're also people who got up and performed tahajjud. They're all extremely trustworthy people, extremely upright people, people who were the greatest of the people after the messengers of Allah, alayhimu salatu wassalam. And it was never divorced from piety, and therefore it was, it didn't result in people's minds getting polluted. Self-censorship has resulted in these kind of, something as simple as capital punishment in Islam being something that's not very widely discussed. In fact, the pressure on the Muslim community to self-censor has got to the point where schools were downgraded to inadequate. This is established kind of issue. Schools were, like when this recording comes out, who knows what's going to happen. But schools were downgraded to inadequate, not because they were teaching this hadith to the children, but because in the library, somewhere in some corner, a book was found that talked about capital punishment in Islam, i.e. something like this hadith. So therefore, this school has an extremism problem. Now, this is all in the context of Prevent, by the way, because one of the Prevent partners was Ofsted. One of the Prevent partners was Ofsted. Now, Ofsted was interviewing children to see if there were any signs of extremism in them, right? And investigating schools to see if there was anything extreme. And one of the things that they looked for was capital punishment in Islam. Why is this being taught to children? Why is this in your library? Well, our children don't, we see what our children are taking, etc. And these things are not taught outside of context. And that context isn't, oh, we explained the Sharia to them and we explained to them that this is not applicable in Britain. That's not really the context, is it? The context is that these issues are never taught in an Islamic tradition. In the Islamic tradition, these conversations are never divorced from the conversations about piety. You don't divorce these conversations from conversations about mercy, from conversations about justice, from conversations about righteousness. It's never divorced from that, right? So think about how you convey teachings of Islam to children today, because that natural environment that used to exist before, where an Imam could speak about anything, etc., has been eroded. Okay? And this is a hadith in the 40 hadith in Imam Nawawi. I'm telling you, if Ofsted picked up on this, they'd say, oh, we were extremists for discussing it in madrasa or something like that. That's how absurd it's become. So, for the record, there's capital punishment in Islam. Okay? So in Islam, I'm going to try and lay this out in as structured a way as I can. So in Islam, so this hadith is one of the foundational hadith on certain aspects of capital punishment. Some of this is in the Quran. Some capital punishments are mentioned in the Quran, others are mentioned in hadith. In this case, the Prophet ﷺ is saying that three things can result in what we call the blood of a believer becoming permissible. Becoming permissible to spill the blood of a believer. One of them, of course, is adultery, i.e. a married person committing zina. A non-married person committing zina is fornication, which also carries a punishment, right? Which is the lashing, right? 100 lashes. This is mentioned in the Quran in Surah An-Nur. And then the qisas, right? And Allah talks about this in Surah Al-Baqarah, where He says, كُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمُ الْقِصَاصُ فِي الْقَتْلَى. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has prescribed for you qisas in murder victims. So that means if a person is murdered, provided it is murder and not manslaughter, using modern terminology. Manslaughter does not carry the qisas. Only murder carries the qisas, right? So manslaughter carries diya, which is the blood payment, right? You compensate the family for manslaughter. And in murder, the family has an option to choose either blood, as in a life for a life, or compensation, right? And they may forgive and accept compensation, and so on and so forth. And then finally, this is the most controversial one of all, which is the death penalty for people who apostate, who leave Islam. And the wording here is very, very relevant, because and something to reflect on. The one who abandons his deen and leaves the jama'ah, al-mufariqu lil-jama'ah, the one who leaves the community of the believers. So this is not a fiqh session, so we don't need to go into every single one of these. I'll touch on the controversy about the punishment for apostasy. But to kind of understand why capital punishment, there's a basic, simple logic. If you want to understand why capital punishment, the message is very, very simple. The crime for which there is capital punishment, right, here the message is simple. Something is being protected that is extremely important to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So important that any violation of it results in capital punishment. Okay? To understand that structurally, right, from an Islamic law point of view, this is how I like to explain it. That the Sharia tells us that the higher objectives of our deen is the protection of certain things. Okay? These are mentioned in various ahadith. I mentioned one in the khutbah today, right? For example, the Prophet ﷺ talking about the fact that the wealth and the blood of a believer is more sacred than the Kaaba. So in this particular hadith, while he was making tawaf, he mentions damuhu wa maluhu wa an yudhanna bihi illa khair. That O Kaaba, how great are you, and how great is your sanctity. But by he in whose hand is my soul, the sanctity of a believer is greater than your sanctity, his blood, his wealth, and that only a good opinion is held of him. So that kind of idea. Anyway, the ulama concluded based on all of the evidences that the things that are sacred and therefore inviolable sanctities of religion, i.e., in no way can any violation of these things be tolerated, and therefore violation of them carries the highest punishment. They are deen, right? Nafs or dam. Nafs and dam is pretty much the same thing. So blood and life. Mal, wealth, right? And then ird, right? Which is honor. Okay, and there's one more I can't remember. Can anyone think of it? Al-mal, wal-dam, wal-ird. And I think sometimes they mention nasab. Nasab, lineage. Lineage. These are inviolable, right, in the Sharia. And sometimes the fuqaha speak in language like this. They say all of Sharia is to protect these 5 things. So all of Sharia is to protect these 5 things. Does that make sense? So one of the things you'd observe in the structure of the Sharia is that it is the violation, in certain cases of the violation of these 5 things, you see capital punishment. Okay? So, in the case of apostasy, deen is violated. Deen is violated. But how exactly? So, number one, Islam, there's no compulsion in religion. La ikraha fi deen. Absolutely, that is fact, right? There's no doubt about that. And therefore, religion is not imposed upon another who has freely chosen a different religion. So what is the case with over here? What's been violated? What's been violated is the sanctity of religion within an Islamic realm. The sanctity of religion in Darul Islam. In the society where Muslims have chosen Islam for themselves, apostasy is an undermining, is to bring the religiosity or the integrity of religion in an Islamic society into severe disrepute. You don't consider yourself Muslim anymore, go somewhere else and be a kafir. Don't do it here in our community. Do you understand? Or keep it hidden. Or keep it hidden. So here there's an important caveat. All capital punishments are predicated on qada, meaning they are all subject to judicial process. That means that they get reported to the system, qadi judges, there's due process and so on and so forth. There's a whole other conversation about what happens if somebody takes vigilante action. Right? Give somebody capital punishment themselves. And there are different views on here, including there are views that this person will face capital punishment themselves. It will be murder if they have not allowed due process to take place, right? But that's a complex conversation, there's no need to go into. But just to make the principle, to state the principle, this is enough. That it goes through judicial process. So, and the same is true of apostasy. Somebody can't decide, astaghfirullah, kafir. Can't do that. You understand? In fact, ulama are broadly agreed that takfir requires judicial process. To even declare a person kafir is a judicial act. It is something that the state has to do, that a qadi has to declare after challenging the person, speaking to the person, debating the person, etc., etc. And then it is up to the qadi to determine whether capital punishment is kind of necessary or not, or if it's applicable or not. And there are lots of views among the fuqaha about this. But why? Does this not defy freedom of religion? Or actually, sorry, that's a secular term. Does this not go against la ikraha fi din? There is no compulsion in religion. Well, it doesn't, because la ikraha fi din is to do with forcing religion upon somebody who isn't Muslim. Over here as well, La ikraha fi din applies. Do you know what? You don't want to be Muslim? Leave the community. You don't want to live as a Muslim in the community, but don't publicly bring Islam into disrepute with your apostasy. This is the best explanation I've come across for this. Another explanation is that public apostasy, and this is public apostasy. The punishment doesn't apply if somebody does it in private, right? Of course, why? Because it wouldn't go through judicial process. It's private, right? The other problem is that public apostasy, and this is a view that I don't think is agreed upon by any means, but I've come across many scholars who I respect who've expressed this, and it makes a lot of sense, that in an Islamic society, there was no technical difference between apostasy and treason, right? And this opinion actually uses this last phrase, al-mufariq lil-jama'ah, to argue this case. That the fact that the Prophet ﷺ described the apostate as somebody who abandons the jama'ah is to show that the Prophet himself equated it to treason. Do you understand? So if you don't want to be guilty of treason, don't apostate in public in an Islamic country. Okay, this doesn't make a lot of sense to non-Muslims nowadays. In the apologetics of Islam versus atheism, etc., etc., it doesn't make sense. It's like, oh, you know, you people, you're like backwards, etc., etc., and you don't give people their freedoms, and so on and so forth. And here, I guess the thing to explain is that, look, we're highly protective of our deen. We're extremely protective of our deen. That can be difficult to understand for people who've historically just allowed their religion to erode and erode and erode and erode and erode and erode and erode until it's beyond recognition. Right? We don't do that. I have another way of explaining this in a slightly different context, right? And I explained this to non-Muslims. I just did it yesterday. We hosted a scouts visit in the masjid. And you guys need to remember this because this is current, it's now, it's relevant now, right? One of the people in the audience last night said to me, it was somebody who was actually a teacher. So she said, what about Christmas? About celebrating Christmas. You guys celebrate Christmas? You know? Wanted to know. So I said, look, so in these situations, my tactic is, it's not a tactic, this is genuine, and to be fair, it's just less relevant to Muslims. You know, if you ask me an opinion, a fatwa, and I know you're Hanafi, I just give you the Hanafi view, you go practice it. Muslims ask a question for practical reasons, whereas a non-Muslim, when they ask a question, it's more academic in nature, so I can expose them to different views. So, and that's helpful with non-Muslims who are not familiar with our culture because it shows nuance, right? And that nuance can be helpful in certain occasions. So on this situation, I said, well, we have a bit of a debate among Muslims about whether Christmas is a cultural celebration or a religious celebration. And here's the fascinating thing, right? One of them turned around and said, we're still having that debate. And this is the second time somebody said that to me. On the other hand, I've sat with a priest who's explained to me that it's, you know, it's like, okay, yeah, we kind of go along with it, but a lot of the celebratory stuff is just cultural, that the church is just humoured. The church is just humoured. Father Christmas and the Christmas tree and all of this stuff, right? It's pretty much, it's cultural, it's commercial. Yeah. So anyway, so I said, look, we have this debate internally, and given that there is this debate, I suppose the Muslim attitude towards it is simple. If you think it's cultural, there is some latitude. If you think it's a cultural celebration, then then there's some latitude because Muslims have a greater tolerance of cultural integration and assimilation. But if it is the sense in a particular community or with a particular scholar that it is a religious festival, then absolutely not. It will be totally boycotted, right? Why? Because, and this is the point I'm trying to make, right? And this is a really good way to explain this, because in Islam, we do not accept any kind of erosion of religious identity. We will not tolerate any erosion of our religious identity, any assimilation that results in the erosion of our religious identity, we will not tolerate. And why this is important, for example, to a non-Muslim audience, especially in today's context, is because it enables us to explain partly why we have not ended up where Christianity is today. All right? It is our intolerance of this that has meant that we've been able to hold on to the religion and that we're able to pass it on to our children and our children's children. And hopefully we'll be able to do that for generations to come, because we do not accept any kind of assimilation, any blending in. By assimilation, I mean blending into a dominant culture. Any blending in that results in the erosion of our religious identity, we do not allow it. Cultural identity, it's fine. Malaysian Muslims are very uniquely Malaysian. Bengali Muslims are very uniquely Bengali. Pakistani Muslims have a certain Pakistani flavor. They have their own unique cuisine, etc. You go to Norwich, you'll find English Muslims, a whole community of them. When you bump into them in the street, you won't even say salam. You'll be like, oh, hi, hello, good morning, good evening. You'll do all of that. But then you go to the masjid, oh, assalamu alaikum, brother, I didn't know you were Muslim. Because they are completely culturally British. Right? English, the dress is English, their food, etc. As long as it's halal, it's very much English food. And I know these people, they're friends of mine. You never, I mean, they're proper middle upper class English people with the accent, and with all of it. Do you understand? You may even be a bit uncomfortable by it, But mashallah, amazing, committed kind of Muslim community, indigenous Muslims, right? So cultural assimilation, no problem. If my Bengali identity eroded because I immigrated to Britain, no problem. No problem. And if in its place I adopted some English characteristics, or my children adopted some English characteristics, which they have, and my children don't even speak Bengali, I have no idea what I'm going to do about that. All right? I feel absolutely guilty and full of shame when I meet my parents. But I haven't got a solution. But for me, it's not the priority. Holding on to the Bengali identity is not the priority. Holding on to the Islamic identity is the priority. Over there, I won't accept any erosion. Right? And that's how I ensure that that deen passes on to them. That point is very much in line with what the Sharia is trying to do in its intolerance of apostasy in a Muslim society. I think that came across okay. That makes sense as an explanation? Yes. All right, good. So, is it treason? Why should it be treason? Right. It should be treason. It's very logical for it to be seen as treason, because it's like you've come out and declared yourself to no longer be aligned to Muslims, right? Now, if you take the fiqh side and you look back at history, you look back at the seerah, there are examples of people who apostated, left the community, and the Muslims did not pursue them for capital punishment. There was no international warrant, all right? They weren't on Interpol's kind of wanted list or something like that. Do you understand? They went, and then later on, there was some period, I can't remember the names. Umar radiallahu anhu's time this happened. They apostated. They went away. They were non-Muslims for a while. Then they came back to the deen, rejoined back into the Muslim community, and they lived as good Muslims. They lived as good Muslims, and they were not pursued for punishment. They were not pursued for capital punishment because they did not bring the community into distribute in the manner of their apostasy. Does that make sense? Once again, this is based on judicial process. By no means is this applicable in Britain, for example, if a young person apostates. Here you have the mercy of this particular ruling not applying to them, and therefore us being able to allow time for this person to hopefully turn back and give them da'wah, etc., because that whole question of bringing the Muslim community into disrepute doesn't apply here. We're surviving ourselves. Do you understand? Because the wider culture is a non-Muslim one or an atheistic one. It used to be Christian, but it's atheistic now. So that's one aspect of it. Similarly, so I'm going in the reverse order because I'm going by order of those sanctities, right? So the next thing that's sacred and that must absolutely be protected and is therefore associated, therefore any violation of it results in capital punishment or some form of capital punishment, is wealth, people's property. Any violation of a person's property can result in capital punishment. That's not mentioned in this hadith, but we're talking about وَالسَّارِقُ وَالسَّارِقَةُ فَقَطَعُوا أَيْدِيَهُمَا جَزَاءً بِمَا كَسَبَا نَكَالًا مِنَ اللَّهِ. Allah mentions in the Quran that the thief, male and female, cut their hands as a punishment for what they have done. Right? It's not quite that literal. Whether or not that capital punishment actually applies, there's a really serious judicial process involved. What they steal has to be of a certain value. It has to be protected. It cannot be easily accessible so that there might be suspicion that it's something that's public or publicly accessible. They must not have done it out of any kind of necessity. They shouldn't be driven by necessity. So like a starving person stealing wouldn't face capital punishment, and so on and so forth. There's all of these conditions when you consider the judicial process. So therefore, but here the inviolable thing is wealth. That everybody's wealth is sacred and it deserves protection. It is their own. And there is no tolerance in an Islamic society of theft. And when you say theft, given the way, shoplifting and all this, the way this stuff is so undermined now, so seen as so nothing. But the way we look at it is, at the root of it is the sanctity of someone's property. Everybody has the right to feel like my property is protected. Does that make sense? And therefore, and any violation of that means that the punishment for it is severe. And in Muslim countries who even to this day have successfully managed to implement at least the principle of that strictness. You don't steal somebody else's property. If you do, you're in trouble. Big time, right? You'll find that even in those countries, you'll find that theft and things like that, it's very, very limited. All right? The next thing is blood or life, right? And hence the capital punishment for murder, right? And other significant implications for manslaughter as well, and so on. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about this, I think, in Ma'idah, when He says, وَمَا كَانَ لِمُؤْمِنٍ أَن يَقْتُلَ مُؤْمِنًا إِلَّا خَطَأً. A believer, it cannot be imagined that a believer would ever kill another believer except by mistake, except by error. وَمَنْ قَتَلَ مُؤْمِنًا خَطَأً. When a believer kills another believer by mistake, then he must free a slave, etc., and then he must give the blood payment, and so on. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about the ukhrawi punishment of murder, right? That how bad murder is, the murder of a believer is in the eyes of Allah. In the akhirah, Allah says, وَمَنْ يَقْتُلْ مُؤْمِنًا مُتَعَمِّدًا فَجَزَاؤُهُ. It's one of the strongest verses of punishment in the Quran. Allah says, anybody who kills a believer deliberately, murders a believer, فَجَزَاؤُهُ جَهَنَّمُ خَالِدًا فِيهَا. Like the punishment is like the punishment of shirk. That his punishment is that he will be in Jahannam forever. خَالِدًا فِيهَا. وَغَضِبَ اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَلَعَنَهُ. And Allah will be angry with him and Allah will curse him. وَأَعَدَّ لَهُ عَذَابًا عَظِيمًا. And Allah will prepare for him a great punishment. Meaning this, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is called the language of zajr, right? The language of zajr, the language of inthar. That the Quran, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala employs wording that is designed to strike fear in a person so that they won't go anywhere near that sin, right? But ultimately the punishment in the dunya is qisas, unless forgiven. Qisas, unless forgiven by the heirs of the deceased, right? So, and qisas is an-nafsu bin-nafs. That's what's mentioned in this hadith. A life for a life. Right, a life for a life. You've murdered somebody. If it is established that it is indeed murder, then the relatives of the victim have the right to seek qisas, in which case this person will be killed. Likewise, there's also an eye for an eye, right? Which Islam the Quran talks about the eye for an eye ruling by telling us about the Banu Israel and the fact that it was for them. وكتبنا عليهم فيها أن النفس بالنفس والعين بالعين والأنف بالأنف والأذن بالأذن والسن بالسن والجروح قصاص. Right? That we prescribed for them that a life for a life, and an eye for an eye, and a nose for a nose, والأنف بالأنف, an ear for an ear, والأذن بالأذن, والسن بالسن, a tooth for a tooth. Right? And there is even qisas for wounds, for injuries. There is even qisas for injuries, right? And this, something along those lines, is implemented in Islamic law as well. Why? Because without justification, it is the unjustified violation of blood, one of those great sacred principles. Does that make sense? Okay. And then what's the next one? So blood. So we had religion, wealth, blood, honor, very, very important. Honor, right? This was really important to discuss because most of the others, in some degree or other, are acknowledged in Western law. And it's often said, I don't have the research for it, but it's often said that Western law was inspired by Europe's contact with Muslims through Spain and so on. It's quite well known, right, that this is the case. But one thing that they didn't learn is the sanctity of honor, of a person's honor, and that a person's honor, and in more layman's terms, right, a person's reputation. That a person's reputation is also an inviolable right, is an inviolable objective of objective. It is for this reason that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَالَّذِينَ يَرْمُونَ الْمُحْصَنَاتِ الْغَافِلَاتِ الْمُؤْمِنَاتِ لُعِنُوا فِي الدُّنْيَا وَالْآخِرَةِ. Anybody who falsely accuses al-muhsanat al-ghafilat al-mu'minat, an innocent kind of an innocent chaste person, then they will be cursed in the dunya and the akhirah. Right? And capital punishment is إِنَّ الَّذِينَ يَرْمُونَ الْمُحْصَنَاتِ ثُمَّ لَمْ يَأْتُوا بِأَرْبَعَةِ شُهَدَاءَ فَاجْلِدُوهُمْ ثَمَانِينَ جَلْدَةً. Anybody who falsely accuses a chaste person and then does not bring 4 witnesses, right, that adultery has been committed, right, then فَاجْلِدُوهُمْ ثَمَانِينَ جَلْدَةً. Give them 80 lashings. 80 lashings. And as a long-term consequence, وَلَا تَقْبَلُوا لَهُمْ شَهَادَةً أَبَدًا. And never ever accept their testimony. Their integrity has been completely destroyed from that point on. Do you know what's really, really tragic about this particular ruling? That if a person accuses another person publicly of zina, and they don't have 4 witnesses, they could face this consequence even though the zina is actually true, that it actually happened. It's just that they don't have the burden, they don't have the evidence. They do not meet the burden of it, because the evidence, the level of evidence required is almost impossible to attain. How are you going to get 4 witnesses to zina? And there's a hadith that say that it has to be, I can't say this here, but it's like, it has to be really like clear. You have to have clearly witnessed the act. Kalmili fil mukhala, you understand what I mean by that, right? Kalmili fil mukhala, I won't translate that. So now it's like, how that's impossible. It's almost impossible for one person to witness that, right? But how are 2, 3, 4 people going to witness that? So it's almost impossible to prove zina. The only way in which zina, the capital punishment for zina, happens is if a person confesses, right? What does that therefore, think about the social imperative here. In a way, what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying is, listen, don't even bother accusing somebody of zina. You're not going to be able to prove it. Let it be. Otherwise, you're going to be punished. Even if you know, even if you've seen it happen, you can't. Why? It's that issue of the deen being publicly undermined. Public morality is undermined when people are allowed to willy-nilly accuse one another of adultery, because it brings down the gravity of adultery in people's minds. So if people have done it in secret, don't come out and make public accusations. It should only come out in public if a person has confessed themselves because they want to make tawbah, right? Or because actually miraculously, there's 4 witnesses, right? Otherwise, don't do it. If a husband accuses his wife of adultery, the process of dealing with that judicially is so embarrassing. You know, the process of li'an, of cursing one another in public, and it's like, who would do that? It's almost as though the whole thing is designed, right, to keep the public space clean of such controversy. All right? But the capital punishment is there for bringing somebody's honor into disrepute. Right? Even if you have truth on your side, you can't bring somebody's honor into disrepute. Similarly, in any kind of defamation, any kind of defamation that results in the loss of somebody's integrity and honor and respect, right, is taken very, very seriously in Islamic law. And lastly, nasab. And the sanctity of nasab, there's obvious capital punishment associated with that particular sanctity, which is the capital punishment for zina. Capital punishment for zina, because what happens when zina becomes well known, right? Or zina becomes prevalent in society, nasab gets clouded, meaning people's lineage gets clouded. And there's a really interesting twist to this as well, right? Which is that it is important that a child has a valid nasab. However, in Sharia, the Sharia would tolerate that nasab not being that child's true nasab. So, no DNA tests. All right? And the Prophet ﷺ has this hadith in which he says, الولد للفراش وللعاهر الحجر. الولد للفراش وللعاهر الحجر. The child belongs to the bed and the adulterer gets the stone. The child belongs to the bed and the adulterer gets the stone. What does that mean? It means, and this is laid out in fiqh, like pretty much Islamic law is built on this principle, that should there be adultery between a couple and the child, then there's pregnancy as a result, right? It is, regardless of who it could be, right, that child belongs to the marriage. That child is a legitimate child of that marriage. The consequence of the zina will separately be taken care of, if you know, in terms of like the adulterer and the punishment for the adultery and so on. But the child belongs to the marriage, i.e., regardless of the truth, regardless who the actual biological child is, that child deserves to belong to a family. That child deserves to belong to a family, right? Because nasab is important. For somebody to have a nasab is important. And if nasabi affiliation, even when nasab is not biological, right? Non-biological affiliations exist through muwala. So, for example, if anybody has been a slave, right, in a family, right, and then that slave is freed, often they didn't have nasabi, like slaves, they weren't in a situation where they've been able to stay in contact with their families, etc., etc. They may have been generationally in slavery, so their parentage isn't, nobody's taking care of it, and so on and so forth. They've lived, these lives of, quite deprived lives, right? So when finally somebody frees them, which is a great act of virtue in Islam, right? It results in that slave remaining affiliated to the family and the lineage of their former master. So much so that you will find in our tradition, thousands of years later, people who were freed slaves being affiliated in the history books to the families who freed them, or to the family of the person who freed them. And they're remembered as Mawali Fulan, right? Or Mawla Fulan. And this exists among the Sahaba, Salim Mawla Hudayfa. Hudayfa radiallahu anhu's freed slave Salim. Do you understand? And this was not seen. He's remembered in this way, and it's not derogatory. This is not seen as derogatory, it's honorific. and of course in the case of Hudayfa and Salim, radiallahu anhuma, it was it's historically quite an interesting relationship in which Hudayfa radiallahu anhu, of course, became Muslim, and Salim became Muslim with him, and he started treating him like his son, and his father hated that, right? The fact that he all of a sudden, he was still his slave, but he was treating him like it was his son, eating with him, and his father's still a kafir, and he's like, how dare you, you're bringing shame on us, you're sharing a plate with your slave, and all of this stuff, right? Of course, Salim radiallahu anhu became a famous scholar of Islam, which was another interesting thing, that in Islam there was clear opportunity for social mobility for people who, it's a different topic, for people who basically were freed slaves and so on. Slavery did not stop people from rising through the ranks of society, even becoming rulers. And therefore there is a slave dynasty in Islamic history, the Mamluk dynasty, right? So slavery did not stop, and it's really important. This is a side kind of point, but it's really important. This distinction is really important because Western slavery and the memory of transatlantic slavery destroyed any possibility of social mobility. Do you understand? People like Mujahid, so Nafi' Mawla ibn Umar, sorry, not Mujahid, Nafi' Mawla ibn Umar, remembered in history, right, as the free slave of Ibn Umar radiallahu anhu, but one of the great mufassirun of the ummah. Right? Bilal radiallahu anhu, freed slave, bought and freed by Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, mu'adhinu Rasulillah. Right? And so on and so forth. This was quite prominent. Anyway, so I can't remember why I moved on to the slavery issue, but I wanted to make that point. Nasab. Right? So nasab is important, even sometimes nasabi connection, even if it defies the biology of the child, the affiliation is so valuable that it is retained. The family connection is retained, right? And so important. The point is that it's so important that the Sharia enshrines until Qiyamah the importance of these sanctities, these 5 sanctities, that with each of them is associated the principle of capital punishment. And it's a principle of capital punishment that often doesn't get executed because the burden of proof is so high, or because it's so rare, for example, for the capital punishment to be carried. Like the capital punishment for zina is extremely rare. The capital punishment for theft often gets waived because people are poor or starving or something. The Prophet ﷺ, this is a really interesting twist to all of this, right? When I was studying, I found this hadith so fascinating. I used to be like, wow, the Prophet ﷺ, what is he doing? He said to the Sahaba, he said, "Idra'ul hududa bishubuhat." He said, capital punishment. He said, push them away with doubts. Do you understand what that means? It means try to make sure the capital punishment doesn't actually take place by casting doubt over the crime. Meaning reduce the crime from the capital punishment level. If you can, where you can, reduce the crime from the capital punishment level to the non-capital punishment level. Right? Do you understand? Entertain anything that might result in, okay, fine, there's a different punishment. This does not meet the burden of proof. So any excuse for it not to meet the burden of proof that results in capital punishment, idra'uhu, right? Push it away. Push the capital punishment away with shubuhat, with ambiguities, with doubts. The Prophet's own practice. This is how the Prophet did it. This couple somebody came to the Prophet and said, I've committed zina. Right? So the Prophet's first reaction was to just completely blank him. Right? Just completely ignored him, just turned away. So the guy comes round and faces the Prophet. You understand? Ya Rasulullah, I've committed zina. And the Prophet turns away from him again. Right? And completely ignores him. Get the message, dude. I don't want to hear it. I don't want to know. Go make tawbah to your Lord. Don't come to, why are you coming telling me for? So then, in other narrations, the man comes and admits to adultery, and Prophet ﷺ says, maybe you just kissed. لَعَلَّكَ لَمَسْتَ. Maybe you just touched, and maybe you just kissed, or qabbalt, and so on. The Prophet is like, make light of it and walk away. This couple was so hell-bent on some sort of dunyawi expiation that they refused all of it. And this was one of the rare occasions on which capital punishment was carried out for zina in the Prophet's lifetime. So idra'ul hududa bish shubuhat. The idea here really is to establish the principle that yes, there will be capital punishment. Absolutely, there will be. If crime for example, most likely I would say the Khalifa of a Muslim land, if there was a sudden surge in theft, he would probably suspend the idra'ul hududa bishubuhat and say, okay, right, from now on, we're going to carry out capital punishments relatively easily for a while. As soon as we have evidence, it's going to happen because there's too many now. Do you understand? But the idea really is to show that, look, here the point is to re-establish the sanctity of the wealth of another, to re-establish the sanctity of the life of a believer, to re-establish the sanctity of people's honor and people's integrity, to re-establish the sanctity, of life, and of nasab and so on. That's the point. Does that make sense? So this is, I feel like, a really good way of understanding and explaining the hudud, which basically this hadith is about. The reason why Imam Nawawi mentions this hadith, by the way, here in the 40 is because this is an important foundation, if you like, an important cornerstone of Sharia. And that's why I spoke about censorship. Because Imam Nawawi is trying to say, look, this is important, it's important that you keep this alive. This is one of those important teachings of the Prophet ﷺ. So Muslims must not lose sight of it, so that they also understand that these things are serious. And secondly, in an Islamic country, in an Islamic society, it would be expected that these things are enshrined in law, right? And there is a judicial process that at the end of it, when the conditions are met, results in these capital punishments. And Muslims, doesn't matter how many prevents strategies there are, we shouldn't have to shy away from this. We should be able to intelligently engage in conversation about these issues. And our children shouldn't have to shy away from this, and we should freely be able to tell our children, yes, in Islam there's capital punishment. Don't you ever steal anything from anyone. Don't you ever falsely accuse anybody of a crime, and so on. This is a really useful way to be able to teach the importance of these things to our children, inshallah ta'ala. That's it. I knew I was only going to have time for one hadith. I have this thing where I start speaking and then things open up. My teachers used to say it's the barakah of the audience. He used to say it's not the speaker at all. He used to say it's the barakah of the audience. Anyway, if you have any questions, please shoot.
Just one quick one.
Yeah.
Other things, I think, have an equivalent punishment in other societies, religions, etc.
You're right.
Is apostasy unique?
No, it's not.
Okay.
I don't think so. I don't think apostasy is unique to Islam. I think there may be,
Judaism is a big one as well.
Huh?
In Judaism,
Yeah.
yeah. If you apostate,
I don't know for a fact, but I don't think it's unique to Islam.
And it equates to treason.
But I wouldn't be surprised if it was unique to Islam. I wouldn't be surprised. For the simple reason that, let's face it, Islam is a deen that is to be preserved until the major signs of the end of time. For it to happen, there are prescriptions within it that are designed to guard it. They're designed to ensure its continuity. They're designed to create a certain cultural mindset, right, within Muslims. I mean, yes, sometimes people do horrible things, like go around lynching each other and so on and so forth, but, and we can never condone stuff like that, and the judiciary needs to step in and get a handle on it. But, it does show that Muslims care a great deal about the preservation of their identity, and they take acts of apostasy very, very seriously, including acts of apostasy that are not necessarily direct declarations of disbelief, but are like but they're in they're kind of they're implied apostasies because of offense caused to Islam, like offending the Prophet ﷺ. Do you understand? Which is very controversial, of course. In Pakistan, we know this whole, doing gustakhi of the Rasul ﷺ, offending the Prophet ﷺ. People used to get lynched by being accused. They're accused. Oh, he's insulted the Prophet. That's it. Lynch him. Kill him. That's vigilante. That's vigilantism. But it is true that would be a capital offense, because it would be a blatant act of kufr to insult the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. And all of this is designed to maintain the integrity of Islam and protect the sanctity of Islam, because the deen must survive, the deen must be protected, and the identity of believers must be seen as extremely important, so that believers also ensure that they will never allow it to be eroded, because all of these protections exist in the Sharia. All right? And which is why it's so tragic to see Muslims allowing the religious identity of their children so easily erode, as though deen was just some sort of cultural affiliation of their forefathers. And like, oh, my children are British now. Yeah, culturally British, but they're religiously Muslim. Yeah, teach him to perform salah, give him an education so that his iman stays firm. Think about his spiritual life. And a lot of Muslims don't do that. They just think of religion as this thing that just can erode with other cultural erosions when people immigrate to a non-Muslim land. But alhamdulillah, for most people that hasn't happened, and Islam enjoys a healthy survival first in Western lands, in non-Muslim lands, and I think we should be proud of that, especially now that we have seen what's happened to Christianity and what's happened to other religions around the world in the face of the atheist onslaught. But not only has it survived, alhamdulillah, yes, many people do leave Islam, and I worry about that, and that's a big focus of my personal work. But there is also a great many people who accept Islam, and da'wah is stronger than many might have expected it to be. And what's really most fascinating is that Islam, without necessarily da'wah by us, it holds this amazing ability to draw people in, and convert them to the deen, even without any effort from us. And so, alhamdulillah ala ni'mat al-Islam. All praises to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we're grateful to Him for granting us Islam, most of us for free. And may He give us the tawfiq to justify that great blessing, so that whatever duties fall upon us as part of our gratitude to Allah, we're able to fulfill it. Inshallah. Jazakumullah khairan. Subhanallah wa bihamdihi.